Hello everyone, welcome to video 3 of project planning, and here I'm going to talk about progressive elaboration. So progressive elaboration is an interactive process of increasing the level of detail in a project management plan as more information and more accurate estimates become available. In other words, in this kind of method, I teach you in my previous videos, I spoke about planning everything in advance. This is a little bit different. You cannot plan things in advance in this method. Rather, you plan as you go along. Now, and this does not mean that, oh, I'm going to do this because it's easier. No, actually, it's much harder. And the reason we do it is a lot of times we don't have all the information available at the beginning of the project. So project planning here will be a very interactive activity. And the more information becomes available to the project plan, then I can make my project plan much more detailed. So here I'm going to be adding detail every time that I have and adding detail, by the way, this is not a project change. Project change is something we'll talk later on. It's much more formal. Here what we're doing is refining or giving more detail to our plan to increase its success. So in terms of project, there's a project plan uncertainty. I want you to imagine this like a little bit like sculpture. You know, you start with a big block. And, you know, when you see them doing sculpture, you don't see them, you know, start in one corner and immediately go to every single detail. What rather they do is they go by layers, right? First, they take the first layer and make it a bulky image. And with every layer in a way that they take, it becomes more and more detailed. So, and this is exactly the same methodology. Maybe the first thing you do in progressive elaboration, all right, you start by defining your boundaries, all right, and you work on the project, you find, okay, now we get more information, we can define our concept, then you can define your design, then you can define your test, then you can define your project goals. So it's very different here because what you're doing is basically you're going from more general to more and more specific until you get exactly what you want. So each phase will reduce uncertainty, but there's a problem as well. And that problem is actually the later on you find out a risk or a problem, then the impact to change your project will be much higher. So in other words, the later on you realize that something must be done, the more it will cost to have that done. All right. So one of the tools you can use for that is called requirement tolerance. So we use requirements. Often some project requirements are difficult or impossible to set at the time initiation. In other words, you might start a project and say, okay, I'm organizing, like the example of the wedding that I gave before. I'm organizing a wedding. How many people will come? You ask the bride and the groom and say, oh, something between 100 and 500 people. And you're like, wow, okay, that's very different, right? So what you do is probably as time goes back or by, or as you give them more detail, that big gap will start to get reducing and reducing. It's probably going to be more like between 200, 300, all right, until you get, okay, it's going to be around 250 guests. And what you're doing is exactly that. You're narrowing it down. So you start and, you know, a lot of times you might, I'm giving the example of an event because it's easy to understand, but if you might have to do with technical requirements, it might have to do with what the user tells you that they want. So, and you need to use these tolerances. We also call them min-max levels at time of initiation to really put a little bit of barrier so that you don't waste time doing things that later on would not be necessary, or to at least be as effective as possible. So as the project progresses, then this band will decrease, and at the time of there's just here a little detail, at the time of design freeze following the development or user testing, the actual requirements can be finalized. In other words, the design freeze is when you stop to test what you want, and this is very normal in new product development where you might say, okay, we're going to stop now, let's test, and actually realize what the customer told you. You have to go back and you might not have to change anything. So design freeze is when you have to wait for the input or for the information you don't have yet. So to summarize, progressive elaboration does not mean that it's easier just because you're going to plan it more later on. Actually, it becomes much harder. We should only use it when actually we cannot plan a project in advance because of a variety of circumstances, like no information available or a very high risk of uncertainty regarding some estimates you have. Okay. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoy it, and let me know if you have any questions.